George York and James Latham were born in the early 1940s, and from the get-go, they were troublemakers. York grew up in a broken home in Ohio, and by the age of 14, he was already in trouble with the law. Latham, on the other hand, was born in Texas and had more of a stable upbringing, but he still had a taste for mischief. York met Latham towards the end of 1959. Both of the teenagers were serving as privates in the U.S. Army, stationed at Fort Hood in Texas. They quickly became close over the following few years until May of 1961, when they went missing. George and James decided to leave the Army and drive to Jacksonville, Florida. On the 26th of May, 1961, they committed their very first crime together in Mix, Louisiana. After encountering a man by the name of Edward J. Guidros, George and James decided to beat him up so that they could steal his truck. Edward was severely injured, but he did survive the ordeal. Only 3 days later, George and James met two women, friends, Patricia Hewitt and Althea Ottavio. Patricia and Althea were out-of-towners from Georgia who were just visiting Jacksonville for a few days. They had planned to spend their day shopping. Instead, they were robbed by George and James, who removed their stockings and used them to strangle both women to death. After the murder, the killers disposed of the car the women had been driving, leaving it in a ditch on the side of the road. By now, there was no going back. George and James were on a spree of quickly escalating crime. They'd made the leap from assault and robbery to murder. To them, it seemed as if they might as well keep going. Armed with a gun, the duo carried out a third robbery in South Carolina on June the 6th. Their intended victim was sitting in a Cadillac nearby, which George and James wanted for themselves. However, despite their military background, their aim wasn't as good as it could have been. None of the bullets they fired hit the mark, and the unnamed man was able to escape to safety. The following day, they made another attempt at a murder, this time in Tennessee, and unlike the previous attempt, this one was a success. They shot and killed John Whitaker, dumping his body and stealing his vehicle. The previous stolen truck that they'd been driving was abandoned nearby. George and James drove John's car for the next 2 days until they decided that it was too risky to keep driving it. They left that car in Illinois and then posed as hitchhikers so that they could find another victim. Albert Reed was driving down the road when he saw the two men attempting to hitch a ride. He pulled over and allowed them into his car, but he was quickly overpowered and then killed. Once again, George and James dumped the body, leaving it in a shallow creek close to the road. Then they continued on their journey behind the wheel of Albert's car. And it wasn't just vehicles that the two needed to steal. By now, they were sorely in need of both money and gas so that they could continue their cross-country crime spree. They stopped at a gas station just outside of Edwardsville, Illinois, and approached the owner, a man named Martin Drenovac. After attacking and killing Martin, they filled up Albert's car with stolen gas and pocketed all of the money that they could find behind the counter. The next stop in their spree was in Wallace, Kansas. On the 9th of June, 1962, Kansas man Otto Ziegler was shot and killed, and his wallet was taken. James and George kept driving on into the night until they reached Craig, Colorado, where they decided to stop in a motel to get some rest. It was in this motel that they came across Rachel Moyer, a teenage girl who worked there as a maid. At only 18 years of age, she became their next victim. After they had murdered Rachel together, George and James disposed of the body at the bottom of a ravine. Her belongings were left with her body. They hadn't even stolen anything from her. They killed Rachel just because. It was the 10th of June when George and James's killing spree was finally brought to an end. After trying to drive one of their stolen vehicles across Utah state lines, the car was recognized, and they were arrested. When in police custody, the duo took a strange approach to the situation, proudly informing investigators, who at this stage only suspected them of car theft, that they had murdered 9 people together. Despite their bragging, it turned out that they were wrong. They'd only killed 7 people, as 2 of their intended victims, Edward J. Guidros and the unnamed man who they had tried to shoot in South Carolina, had been able to survive the attack. Regardless of the accuracy of their claims, The fact that two men with no criminal history that had left the Army had killed 7 people in 1 month, and that was extremely alarming. So what was the motive for 2 U.S. Army privates to go AWOL and dive headfirst into a life of violent crime? According to George and James, their killing spree had been triggered in part by being put into a mixed-race Army unit. Both men disagreed with serving with soldiers of other races, and this is why they decided to desert. From then, the sudden dose of freedom and the sense of injustice they felt spiraled into violence, according to them. George and James had been on the move constantly, crossing from state to state and rarely staying in one place for very long. It meant that they'd killed people in multiple states, and although it was quickly decided that they deserved to face the death penalty, each of the states followed different procedures for executing criminals. The state of Colorado was still gassing prisoners to death, while Tennessee, Illinois, and Florida all carried out executions using the electric chair. In the end, it was decided that George and James would go to trial in Kansas. That meant, if they were found guilty at their trial, they would both face execution by hanging. With their poorly concealed crimes and the fact that they had openly bragged to the police officers about their murders, showing no signs of remorse, the decision was easy for the jury to make. On November 8, 1961, George York and James Latham were both sentenced to death. George and James spent just under 4 years on death row. While incarcerated, they met 2 other prisoners, Perry Smith and Richard Hickok, who had committed a quadruple murder together in 1959. Later, Perry and Richard would become infamous in American society after the author Truman Capote wrote a best-selling nonfiction novel, In Cold Blood, about their crimes. The success of In Cold Blood made many people consider Perry and Richard, who had been relatively unknown in the years after they committed the murder, to be 2 of the most famous murderers in history. By their association with Perry and Richard, George and James ended up being featured in the novel as well, even though both men had been executed by the time it was published. And if you've read In Cold Blood, you know that it goes into almost a mini novel within a novel talking about George and James. They were described as being completely unremorseful, dismissive of the harm that they had caused, and being generally unpleasant to others. On the 22nd of June, 1965, George York and James Latham were executed by hanging at Kansas State Penitentiary. Both executions went off without a hitch, and the public consensus was that the world would be a better place without 2 unremorseful killers roaming free. Since that day, nobody else has been executed in the state of Kansas, even though several criminals have received a death sentence. James Latham died first, and even in his final moments, when most people would take an opportunity to say that they're sorry or profess their innocence, he didn't appear to regret what he had done at all. His last words were, quote, "I'm not mad at anybody." He did not, however, address how many people might be mad at him for his violent, petty crimes. Somehow he viewed himself as a victim. George York's last words were also fairly unusual for a murderer. He stepped up to the noose and confidently stated, "There is nothing to say but that I'm going to heaven." That's 10-Minute Murder for today. Brief and bingeable true crime. I'm Joe, the host, and I really appreciate you listening today. And this is one of those very, very rare episodes that wasn't requested by anyone, as far as I know. I don't think anybody requested this one. I requested this one. This is one of those episodes that I usually don't do because I've found in the past that the ones that I most want to talk about, you guys don't really want to hear them. I think my ideas are not quite as good as your ideas. But the reason why this was added to the list of episodes that I would do a story on is because I read In Cold Blood last summer. If you're an OG listener, you remember that I was away on a work trip for, was it like 10 days, 2 weeks, something like that? I was in Florida, and it was during the summertime. I was in a hotel resort thing on the beach, had a lot of free time on my hands, because not to go into detail about what I do for an actual living, but we were waiting on some stuff to happen. And during that time, I was reading In Cold Blood. So I was sitting at the pool reading this book. I was sitting on the beach reading this book, and it like consumed my world for the like 3 or 4 days. And this story was, like I said in the episode a minute ago, it was like a mini novel within a novel. They talked a lot about this story, but it was super interesting the way Truman Capote wrote it. And I thought, hey, this will be something I can talk about. And by the way, if you have not read In Cold Blood, still holds up. It's very interesting. It's very good. So that's why this story was done. It was one of the rare ones that I decide to do. 99.9% of the ones that I talk about are the episodes, are the story ideas that you submit. And if you'd like to make a suggestion of a story that I can talk about, joe@10minutemurder.com. That's the quickest and easiest way to get it in front of my eyeballs. That's my email address, joe@10minutemurder.com. And if this is your first time listening to 10 Minute Murder, please subscribe now so that you can catch up on all the back episodes and never miss any of the new ones. Connect with me on social media. You'll see the visuals of what we talk about here in the podcast. And if you like this episode, please leave a rating and review on Apple or any place that's possible. Your positive feedback is very much appreciated. Go to 10minutemurder.com for all things 10 Minute Murder.